Okay, hello everyone, and this is Eric Weber as usual to talk about Westheimer, Joel Westheimer's book, What Kind of Citizen, in particular to talk about chapters 4 through 6. The first one, chapter 4, is about how did this happen. Chapter 5 is what kind of citizen, talking about 3 kinds of citizen, and then chapter 6 is about the first one, the personally responsible citizen. So chapter 4 begins with sort of a joke, or a parable would be sort of an overly kind way to refer to this story. So there's someone who's looking for his keys under the lamplight, and someone, kindly comes to help out and look for keys as well. And then after a while of looking, they just don't, so you lost your keys here underneath the lamplight? And the guy said, no, actually, I lost them over there. So the person replies, well, why on earth are you looking for the keys here? And the guy replies, well, the light's better here. And the joke, maybe you don't laugh and maybe you don't think it's funny, but the point is that people will often look at something because it's easier to observe or easier to measure, not because it's what's worthwhile. And so by the same token, we tend to test things that are sort of easier to test, not because they're the more important thing, which is kind of what this whole book's been about. What kind of citizen do you want to educate? And it isn't all about reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? There's more. There's matters of citizenship and norms and values and justice and democracy that we should think about. And one of the things that Westheimer points out is this common notion that you should teach what matters, but the problem is that what gets tested is what gets taught. Right, that's on page, let's see, somewhere around 28, 29. This language of what's tested is what gets taught. Since we're not very good about systematically measuring certain things we do care about, we then come to care about the things that we can measure easily, which is stupid, right? It's getting the cart before the horse. It's sort of, the dog wagging the tail, or sorry, so the tail wagging the dog. I said it wrong. The idea is that students do acquire knowledge and you can test them on that knowledge. But so often what you need is breadth of curriculum. You need exercise of judgments. You need people to be able to work together, to be patient with each other and kind, and to look out for each other, to think critically about things. And we talk about that, but we don't really test critical thinking in ways that sort of matter socially for democracy. And this is one of the problems that he's talking about. And when you make more and more cuts to education spending, you do what's easier, which is things like standardized tests and scantrons take less time. So you could have larger class sizes, teaching more students and more classes, if you can sort of easily scan the tests. But our scantrons and our standardized tests and multiple choice tests, the kinds of things that are testing the most important stuff we care about. That's sort of the question. 50% of teachers, says Westheimer, leave the profession within their first 5 years. That's on page 32. Why do you suppose that is? And if Westheimer is right, he's telling us that the issue is that we're not treating teachers as professionals who engage in the art of educating people. We treat them as workers who are supposed to follow a script and get people to study certain things that are easily measurable. And that's got to be mind numbing. I wouldn't want to teach in that kind of environment. I don't. I'm very fortunate to teach in higher ed, where there's far more freedom still for professors, but that could change too. And this is one of the kinds of things we're sort of terrified about. This is on page 33. Talented teachers need the freedom and professional autonomy to work the magic of their art in a myriad of different ways that defy standardization and regimentation of practice. I've been teaching since 2002. As I record this video, it's 2020. And I can tell you that is thoroughly true and meaningful in my experience. It resonates profoundly that for me to do the best job, it was always hardest when I was sort of compelled and limited by someone else's devices, rather than thinking through how, in my mind, in my own way, I could envision and understand the thing I'm to teach. in the way that makes the most sense, that can most thoroughly connect with students' interests, and that I think can be used to cultivate their powers of judgment and critical thinking. Every time I had sort of others' limitations, I found it harder to do that well, and I struggled. Whereas when I could design things myself intelligently, carefully, with a variety of possible avenues and sources and things to try and test out, some things won't work perfectly, other things will work better. And over time, you refine your curriculum, your methods, and your tools. It's the way to go. It's amazing. It makes all the difference in the world. 1,000 teachers leave the profession every day at the time of the writing of this book. On page 32, he notes that. So one question I have for you is to ask you, did you undertake schoolwork that translated powers, developed into potential for action beyond school? So things that, for instance, I sometimes have worked with students on has had to do with, you do writing in school, right? And so where is writing important? Well, every day it comes out in newspapers, arguments about what things should happen in terms of policy or other practices, right? And so op-ed writing is one thing one can do. And I've had students work on op-ed assignments before. I could do that again in EPE 301, though I haven't yet. Public speeches, right? People are terrified of speaking in public often, but when you have something you really care about and you feel the need to speak up, you got to be ready and able to, right? Anyway, there's a number of different possibilities. I've got notes here that you can look at on Canvas online. But think about the ways in which your schoolwork enabled you to contribute. And also think about the ways in which your teachers seem sometimes sort of really limited in terms of what they were able to devote time to and so on. Maybe you couldn't tell from that side of the desk, but if you have thoughts about that, I'd be interested. In chapter 5, we finally get to sort of the meat and potatoes of this book about three kinds of citizen. What kind of citizen is the question that the chapter begins with? Well, the thing is, most people would say, according to Westheimer, that children should learn to be good citizens. I don't think very many people would deny that kind of issue, that kind of question or matter. But at the same time, there's profound sometimes disagreement about the details of what it means to be a good citizen. That's basically the point of the book again. What kind of citizen do we want? And so now we're going to get a framework of three ways of thinking about the kind of citizen that you might be intending to cultivate wherever there's a citizenship cultivation or education program. And this is on page 39. In fact, I'm going to share my screen and show you the chart. Of course, there's more information, but this is sort of a summary chart we get from Westheimer about what kind of citizen. There's three kinds. The personally responsible citizen is one kind of person you might be trying to educate and cultivate. The participatory citizen, and then the social justice oriented citizen. Now, you can look at this chart on your own, page 39, and I'm going to stop sharing because I can just talk through this. So at the end of the day, the personally responsible citizen, the person you're trying to educate to that end, is somebody who acts responsibly in the community, works and pays taxes, helps those in need, obeys the law, contributes to a food drive, let's say. And the latter is charity. Like, it's one thing to focus on oneself, and one can think that character and personally responsible citizenship might especially focus on the individual, right? It's my responsibilities. I have certain responsibilities, so you might be focused on yourself. But actually, such people often are highly charitable. Like, America is a very charitable country, right? There's more giving than ever in history. Like, partly because the United States is incredibly wealthy is part of the issue there. But the idea of personally responsible citizen is somebody who sort of does right on his or her own, obeys the law, and is giving, both in service and in resources. The participatory citizen is the second category of citizen. This is somebody where the point is in each of these cases has to do with the ways in which the education you're engaging in is targeting this kind of citizen, right? So the second kind of citizen, the participatory citizen, is somebody who's a highly active member of, say, community organizations, for instance, or who knows how government agencies work and is able to sort of participate in informing or advocating to certain agencies to get some kind of change to happen where there's some sort of problem. Knows and practices strategies that accomplish collective tasks. So if you, for instance, if you have to have a certain number of signatures in order to make, let's say, a petition successful to get a stop sign at an intersection, well, then you know both the agency to which you need to appeal, you know how many signatures you need to get, you know which kind of community you need to canvass, and what more you need beyond signatures to put this on the panel's consideration or something like that of the agency. And then the meeting to attend to deliver the signatures, and then they'll consider it, weigh the costs and benefits, and then make a decision, maybe resulting in your stop sign getting put in place. Such people might also organize a food drive, and a food drive, again, is yet again a charitable endeavor. So this is not something that's going to compel anybody or necessarily change social structures. Charity can be wonderful. It can save lives. It can be a big deal. But at the end of the day, it rarely makes a very lasting impact, unless you're just sort of saving an immediate life or something like that. But a charitable contribution, at the holidays, maybe you feed someone one night. Well, but there's a lot of nights that homeless people go hungry or get cold. And so there's questions still to ask. Charity is a valuable thing, and it's wonderful, and there's a lot of good done with it. But the third kind of citizen is worried about just being, say, charitable, and so the third kind of citizen that you might target with education is the social justice oriented citizen. What Westheimer tells us is that this person critically assesses social, political, and economic structures, explores strategies for change, seeks out and addresses areas of injustice, explores why people go hungry, and advocates for solving root causes. And questions systems and patterns that produce injustice, and is less focused on issues of charity. It's not that such people aren't charitable. It's just that if you're able to bring about change with regard to why people go hungry, well, then that food drive is less of an issue, right? And so people who are looking to make social justice a reality are going to be less interested in the very short term gain that can be made with some sort of small charitable drive. Why not change the system? And you might think that that's a recent thing, or that's or but as Westheimer points out, Harold Rugg in the 1930s was a social justice oriented educator and textbook writer who was very popular until World War II, and later anti-communist forces pushed back against such things and wanted just to focus on character education and not on considering problems of people starving, going hungry, and so on, issues of deep social justice sorts of problems. Those are our three categories, right? The personally responsible citizen, the participatory citizen, and the social justice oriented citizen. That's what's going on in chapter 5 of Westheimer. It's a fairly simple set of ideas, and yet Westheimer, published important work analyzing different kinds of citizenship education, coming to these very useful categories that then focus on very particular things. Think about it this way: the personally responsible citizen, is going to be somebody who wants to be upright in his or her behavior, but isn't looking to make systemic or social changes. You might make some benefits happen with your charity, and you might help people in need to some extent and sometimes, but the question is individual behavior with regard to that all that's needed when there can be systemic regular problems? For instance, before the Great Depression in America, people thought about issues of unemployment as merely matters about that called for charity, right? If people are unemployed and there's sort of a wave of unemployment, well, then maybe a charitable effort can get people over the hump, let's say, and back to work. That sounds nice, but what we found in the Great Depression is that it is the case, and if you look at economics and American history, it is the case that unemployment is not a temporary problem. It's a chronic problem. It's a regular, all the time kind of problem, which therefore, according to certain authors, necessitates systemic action to make sure we try and help people who become unemployed and it chronically happens not always to the same persons, right? And so having policies in place is a far greater assurance that people are going to get what they need in times of difficulty. And so that's an example of sort of thinking systematically. So now let's talk about chapter 6. This is going to be a relatively short video. Chapter 6 is about the personally responsible citizens approach, and Westheimer raises questions about it. And the opening involves another. This one is more reasonably called a parable, I guess, about babies floating down the river. Imagine, of course, like these little baskets or something that float, and babies are floating down the river. And people run into the river and sort of save the babies from going over the waterfall and dying. And they repeatedly keep running out to the river, and there's more and more babies coming down the river, and people just constantly focus on rushing out to the river to save those babies. And that sounds like a valuable and wonderful thing to do. The issue that Westheimer points out is that that approach may never involve asking the question, why are all these babies coming down the river? And it may be that we ought to go and help each one of these who comes, at the same time having some people raise the question, what in the heck is going down is the wrong word to use, but what's going on upriver? And so having some people go upriver and see what's going on, looking at root causes, is clearly more sensible than only ever addressing symptoms of bigger problems. And that's on page 44 of this parable. So um, Westheimer doesn't pull any punches and isn't vague about the matter. Westheimer argues that the personal responsibility approach in education is not enough. I'm not telling you have to agree with this. The question is, do you disagree? And if so, how and why do you disagree? What is wrong with Westheimer's argument? Here's one of the things Westheimer asks us: what's the difference between a democratic school and an authoritarian school? Because volunteerism is possible in either. You might get volunteers in communist societies or dictatorships. You get all these people volunteering and looking like good citizens. But what you won't get in the authoritarian society is questioning about social and economic structures that are unjust. Right. And so in a democratic society, we have all kinds of freedom to speak, associate, and think about our society. And while we may have those freedoms, the question is, are we educated and empowered for such thinking? Because you may get some rare exceptions who do that thinking well if you're not educated for it. But the point of an education is you substantially raise the quality and abilities of the larger majorities of people when you educate people systematically. And so if you've got an unjust society and you educate people about how to question injustice in your society, you're going to have far more people looking into the matter and being advocates for progress. And so, at bottom, the personally responsible citizen kind of form of education leads people to be complacent, Westheimer argues, and or accepting of unjust laws, right, out of an unquestioning acceptance of the law and the status quo. In addition to that, the character education efforts, can be evaluated and shown to make such a great contribution. But if the evaluations are only focusing on these character matters rather than on your ability to analyze, to think critically, to raise questions, to think about justice and ethics, then of course the character education evaluations are going to look better. But it depends on how you evaluate things, and what it is we value should be guiding how we evaluate programs. That's the point. We all want to live with kind and generous and honest people, writes Westheimer, but democracy requires more than individual character development. This is Westheimer's argument. If we don't want anything to change in our society because we think it's wonderful, we might think about social justice advocates as agitators. We might think these are people who are going to unsettle my comfortable and happy way of life. But if you think about the value of democracy, part of the point is that if I don't see how other people are suffering, well, the wonderful thing is that they can tell me about their suffering. They can tell me about the problems they face. And if I think only my good is what matters, well, that's not terribly democratic at all. And if you get enough people mad at you, they'll vote out your ideas. And so you want to listen, you want to think, you want to speak about not losing important things that you don't want to lose. That's a typically sort of conservative attitude. That makes sense. Good things we shouldn't let go of too easily. On the other hand, if things are good only for a few people, the question is, could we not raise the well-being of more people somehow systematically and make everyone better off to some degree, right? And that's the question. And so I've got a summary of 5 questions for you. Number 1, how and when have you experienced education being treated as mechanistic, as technocratic, as dehumanized, as sort of the Scantron approach to education, rather than sort of cultivating your critical thinking abilities and so forth? I've often asked you questions about the other way around, about times when teachers have allowed you to be creative. I don't think I've very often asked you this side of things, like kind of when you felt like a number, right? When have you felt like what you're doing is just technocratic sort of repetition of a formula that doesn't need thinking to allow you to do it, right? How and when have you experienced that side of things? I don't think I've asked you terribly often, if at all, about that side of things. Number 2, wouldn't most people say that children should learn to be good citizens? If so, why is there such disagreement about the details about making that happen? Question 3, we know that laws can be unjust, as in slavery or segregation laws. If that's the case, how can character education and teaching respect for the law be thought to be enough for a democratic society? What do you think? Number 4, now this is a question that's going to require some honesty here. Do you respect the law? Right? This is one of the premises of the education for personally responsible citizens, right? Is respect for law. That's one of the aspects of that. Do you respect the law? Number 2, or no, not number 2. This is question 4, and it's got a couple parts, okay? So the first part was, do you respect the law? The second part of question 4 is, have you ever exceeded the speed limit? And I'm going to acknowledge and admit that I have exceeded the speed limit at times. If those 2 things, if you think you respect the law and you've exceeded the speed limit, the next question is, how do you reconcile respect for the law with driving faster than the speed limit? Right? How do you think about that? I've got my own answers, and I'm happy to share them with you after you tell me what you think. But I want to know what you think. How do you respect the law? And if so, how can you justify driving faster than the speed limit? Number 5, last question. Should teachers feel an obligation to cultivate critical thinking, for the analysis of social structures and social justice? Why or why not, in light of Westheimer's categorizations and arguments? So I want to ask you this in relation to these categories of the personally responsible citizen, the participatory citizen, or the social justice oriented citizen. I look forward to reading what you have to say, and let me know if you have questions. All right, y'all.